Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. My guest today is Jim Johnsen, Vice President of Executive Search for Greenwood Asher and Associates and former President of the University of Alaska System. Jim's new book, Public University Systems, Leveraging Scale in Higher Education, offers a fresh look on how public university systems can challenge access, affordability, and workforce development by leveraging their scale, potentially sparking changes that can transform the country's education system. Jim's no stranger to changing in higher ed. He was president of the University of Alaska System when Alaska's governor massively cut its budget. And Jim shares with us some of the challenge that they faced, along with his and my perspectives on how to make higher ed systems more sustainable and better meet the needs of today's and future students. Jim, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Drumm. It's great to be here.
I am so looking forward to our conversation. You just released a new book called Public University Systems, Leveraging Scale in Higher Education, and this focuses on a lot of the work that you did when you were the president of the University of Alaska System. Before we get into that, give us a little bit about your background so our listeners know who you are as a person.
Okay, well, thank you, Drumm. I appreciate this opportunity. I was born in Germany, an army brat, so moved everywhere there were tanks. My dad was from California, so I ended up going to college there, and then got really interested, frankly, because of the Vietnam War and wondering why my dad was deployed a couple of times. And that got me into politics. How do people make decisions? How do organizations make decisions? And studied that through school. And after my undergraduate experience, I went off to graduate school. And after my first year, decided to go visit my college girlfriend in Alaska and stayed there. So worked in state government for a number of years, finished up my master's at the University of Chicago via, mailed them a paper basically, and then got really interested in labor relations and went to work for the University of Minnesota as its chief labor negotiator and back to Alaska. So all in 35 years in Alaska with time in the private sector, in a telecom, also an Alaskan Native corporation, running the administrative side of those companies, and also had a similar role in the University of Alaska System. And then in, I guess it was 2015, became president of the University of Alaska and did that for 5 years, and then became a senior fellow for the National Association of System Heads, thinking about systems and their importance, including beginning this book at that time. And then in the last couple of years, I've been an executive with Greenwood Asher, a higher education executive search firm. So this book is really my side hustle, I guess you will. I really love to have my feet both in the arena and in the world of action, but also at the same time, I like to be up on the balcony, observing and thinking about the larger patterns.
That's a fascinating background. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about my background as well, having both military background, corporate background, and higher education. Your background kind of reminds me of a good friend of mine, Britt Kerwin, who says when he went for his undergraduate at Kentucky, he tells folks, I went to university and I just never left.
Well, the way I put it is it just took me a long time to get it. So,
Yeah. Well, I get that one as well.
Mm,
So you just published the book, and I know you're working on the second in they all come out in threes, don't they?
yeah.
So you just published the book, Public University Systems, Leveraging Scale on Higher Education. Give us a little background on the book. Why did you decide to write it? And we're going to get into all sorts of stuff, but what were some of the learnings that you had?
Yeah. Why did I write it? Well, one is I was keenly interested in the why of public university systems because they're so prevalent, so important across the country. And because I worked in them and tried to lead in them, I was particularly interested in the how as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's very little in the literature about it, very little. In fact, interestingly, it was roughly 50 years ago this year when two important works were done on university systems. When the iconic university system head Clark Kerr left the University of California and went to work for the Carnegie Commission, he led a couple of studies of systems. And years later, I had the great occasion to be a visiting scholar at Berkeley at Clark Kerr's invitation, so spent time with him. So kind of got very, very interested in systems, but noticed there was very little about them written. So that's one reason I wanted to really pull together the best brains I could on systems to document current thinking and to think about practical ways that systems could deal with their many, many challenges. The second thing, there wasn't much known about these systems. At the same time, they're incredibly prevalent and they're the dominant paradigm for how states govern, coordinate public higher education in their states. 44 of the 50 states use systems. 75% of America's college students are in these systems. So I thought, wow, these things are really important. They're powerful, they're big, and yet we don't know much about them. And frankly, many of the people who are in leadership roles in these systems haven't been trained to think holistically, to understand the unique ability of systems, university systems, to leverage their scale, to accomplish really important political, social, and economic goals of their states. So that really was the impetus for this book. I went to Johns Hopkins University Press to publish it. They peer-reviewed the proposal and it passed. And then I got to work recruiting the authors, editing all their chapters. And it was really a fun process, but logistically it was a challenge, I assure you. But it's very gratifying to have it out here now, which gives me the ability to have great conversations with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I am curious, how does one get trained to be a system president or a system chancellor? I mean, they're in 44 different states, but when I look at it, and I look at Britt's career, I mean, he was the president at the University of Maryland, College Park, at Ohio State, and then they pulled him back to be the chancellor of the Maryland system of universities, 12 different universities and colleges. How does one get that training to be able to look big picture versus the big picture for a smaller university? How does that happen?
Well, that's a great question. And there are lots of different paths. One of the authors in the book and a great expert on university systems has said, quote, when you've seen one university system, you've seen one university system, close quote. Dennis Jones, a tremendous man and somebody who's worked in all 50 states and all of the systems in the country. So there are probably as many paths. Probably the most dominant path is someone who was like Britt, who was the head of a flagship campus. And what the head of a flagship campus gets the experience of doing is, one, leading a very complex organization when you think about professional schools, medical centers, etc. Second aspect of that is the political role, working with state and federal agencies, particularly, again, in a flagship university. In a university system that doesn't have a flagship, doesn't have a medical school, etc., those kinds of experiences are not going to be as common because there's already a system head taking care of the politics and taking care of those issues. So I think that's a well-trod path. Another is coming up through a system, as I did. I came up through a system, left for the private sector, and then came back, frankly, intending to come back. And my plan leaving the system was to go out and learn business and work in business and really discover from the business side what the needs of the state were with respect to workforce, with respect to business development and innovation and those sorts of things. So came back with that sort of more rounded experience. Often they come from political organizations because so much of the role is political. And sometimes they come from business, but there is no one path, I would say. The skills one picks up in terms of financial savviness, being politically adept, understanding how to work with a board, how to work with political leaders. I mean, that's the basic skill set. But to also be able to see across a complex organization, whether it's a campus or a system, and see where complementarity might be, where focus can take place, where unnecessary redundancy, and not all redundancy is unnecessary, but where unnecessary redundancy can be, frankly, eliminated and the organization can build on its strengths to meet the needs of those outside of the organization. Because that's the primary mission of these institutions. Yes, they need to serve their own interests to some extent, but ultimately to succeed, they need to fulfill a mission on behalf of society as a whole. And so I think somebody who can do that.
Particularly the states in which they are. It's like you said, when you've
Mhm.
seen one system, you've seen one system.
Mhm.
Every state, we've got 50 states, at least that was the last time I counted them. I could be wrong on that. But when you've got so many different states doing things different ways, you basically in one thing you need to break it down into the types of systems you have, and I think you did
Mhm.
this very well. Tell us about the different types of systems, and from there we're going to get down into some of how does a system chancellor or system president work to solve problems.
Mhm. 44 of the 50 states have them. And the systems, in some states, there's one system. In other states, Texas, I believe, has 7 systems. They're all unique. They do share some characteristics, and I'll talk about those in just a second, but they really reflect the unique histories, geography, culture, economics, location of their states. So it's reasonable to expect them to be different. But you can classify them or characterize them to some extent. One way is, are they homogenous or heterogeneous in terms of their mission? So, an example of an homogenous system, that is, every institution in the system has a very similar or the same mission, would be, well, two examples would be the University of California system, where all of the campuses are research and doctoral universities. So they share a mission, they share a board, they share lots of things there. Another example of a homogenous system would be the California State University system. In fact, now that I think of it, all 3 systems in California are homogenous. The community
Right.
college system as well. So they each have their own mission and purpose with many institutions in them. So that creates a certain dynamic in terms of governance that's different from heterogeneous systems, which include institutions of different missions. The SUNY system, State University of New York system, for example, has research universities to community colleges. Wisconsin is similar. Hawaii is similar. Alaska, to some extent, is similar. And that creates some interesting opportunities in terms of transition and articulation of students from one segment of higher education to another segment. But it also creates some really challenging decisions for boards because they have to allocate resources differently to those missions, which have some overlap, but they're different. You know, research
Mhm.
university is really, the faculty are different than the faculty at a community college.
Really? I never would have guessed. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one.
Yeah.
So, and in these heterogeneous
Hmm.
systems, some of them have one board, some of them have multiple boards. I mean, University of Hawaii has one board for
Hmm.
the 10 institutions in that system. I think I'm remembering that correctly.
That's correct.
But but you've got others that have multiple boards. How do you get, and is there, I'm asking for a generalization, and I'm sure there isn't one. Is there generally a system board and then each school has its own board? Or is it just kind of a free for all and all the boards have to work with the legislatures?
Well, it varies. I'd say the dominant paradigm is one board over multiple institutions in the system. There are exceptions. A good exception would be Florida. And in Florida, there are 12 universities in their state university system. There's a board of governors overseeing the entire system. And then each one of the universities in the system has a board of trustees. And the way they've set it up there is they've differentiated the roles and responsibilities between the boards of trustees at the university level and the board of governors at the system level. So all of that is laid out in statute in Florida.
Sure.
So that's an example. Another variant of this is states with a governing board over the system and a coordinating board on top of it. So a board that it doesn't govern, but it does studies. It assesses workforce needs in the state. It might advise the governor and the legislature on the system budget requests. And that's done for several reasons. One is to provide a check, if you will, or a capacity for state level policymakers to allocate resources in a way that's best for the state and not solely in the interest of the university system as articulated by the university system. So that model is out there as well. But typically, the system will interact directly with the governor, the system leadership, and legislators. And in some states, they allow the campus chancellors or presidents, depending upon the state, different titles, to interact with legislators as well. But typically, the single point of contact between a university system and state elected officials is the system head, system office.
And it's kind of interesting because here in New Mexico, you have multiple public institutions. There is no, quote, system here. And each of the presidents of the universities have their own board of trustees or board of regents. And they're going up to the legislature to bargain for resources. So in some ways, it leaves it up to the legislature to say, okay, University of New Mexico, you're going to get X number of dollars for this area. For New Mexico State University, you're going to get Y dollars, but you're competing in the same areas. So what do we do about that? I mean, it seems to me like a bit of a free-for-all, and it puts the legislatures in a position where they're having to make decisions based on input that they may or may not understand.
Well, I think that is the case in states without systems. So New Mexico or Michigan are examples. And then states with multiple systems, right? So there's going to be that advocacy. Now, a state with multiple systems, I mentioned Texas with 7 systems, they have a coordinating board. And so that coordinating board is really in charge of state level planning so that when the systems go to the legislature for resources, the legislature can rely to some extent on the work that coordinating body has done. But you're absolutely right. One of the big reasons why legislatures have established systems is to create that integrating, consolidating organization that may buffer them from direct interaction and having to make those difficult yes or no choices favoring one university over another. They've created this system that has the responsibility with a board that has a responsibility for allocating the state appropriation to the institutions based on their unique knowledge and their closer knowledge of what's going on and what the needs are on the campuses.
So I think at this point, it's important for listeners to understand the hierarchy of this because you've got governors, you've got your legislators, employers, community leaders, you've got systems leaders, boards, presidents. Each one should be responsible for a certain role. For example, when we talked yesterday, we talked about governors. Their responsibility should be what's the vision for the state's future and what should the goals for higher education be for that state to realize that vision? Talk us through those if you would.
Yeah, and I wish it were the case in more states that governors had visions for their states and
Oh, we're not going into politics today.
No. But ideally, governors would consult with leaders in the state and formulate a vision for their state. And that vision may be in economic terms, cultural terms, political terms, whatever that is. But whatever it is, there needs to be a higher education component because it's about the people of the state that are going to make that state successful, that are going to improve the health status of that state, that are going to attract foreign capital to build facilities, to manufacture things in that state. That's all driven by human capital, by the brains of the people in that state. So having an overall vision for the state and included in that a vision for higher education and its role and goals. And hopefully, again, that would be supported by the legislature. Well, then in most states, the governor then appoints a board of regents over, or trustees or governors, varies by state, a board. And then that board needs to develop its own plan for the system that supports the governor's plan, the state plan. And then below that, if you will, but not in terms of importance, just simply in terms of the hierarchy, so the governor, state level, board, system level, then the institutions need to have plans with goals and resources that support the system plan and goals that in turn support the state plan and goals. And that way, at each level of this three-level structure, you've got a higher purpose that provides several really important values. Perhaps the most important one is that it can be shared across the potentially competing forces and factors within each of those levels. So let's take the university system level. Maybe there's competition among the campuses in the university system. Well, if the university system says, hey, we have a higher purpose, our mission and purpose is at X, then how do we all come together and serve X? And that it should enable anyway, the institutional level folks to say, well, I'm going to put interest number 1, 2, and 8 on the side here because I have shared interests with my colleagues at the other campuses that will move us expeditiously together in meeting the system's goal in serving the state's goal. So always having some kind of higher purpose is a way to pull people together. They may not get all of their interests met, but ideally their most important interests are met as they serve a higher purpose, which generally is to meet the state's needs for higher education.
Yeah.
Without that structure of higher purpose and goals, then centrifugal forces will dominate. And it just becomes a very competitive, not that competition is bad, but it becomes a very competitive and self-serving marketplace. And markets are great. They truly are. But in this process, public sector higher education, there's so many opportunities for leveraging scale and a system being more than simply the sum of the institutional parts. An example, procurement. Why should N number of institutions have their own procurement functions when they can have one procurement function that has much more market power and can go out there and get better prices for things? Research administration would be another example. Payroll would be a good one. Mm-hmm. General counsel, even accreditation, which is done at the institutional level, but often in a small system, there isn't the expertise at multiple campuses for that. You could have that at the system level. The real, I think, something to look forward to is the possibility of increased academic collaboration. That's not as common today as it could be, where faculty at different institutions are working together in delivering academic programs for students wherever they are across a state, in whatever institution they are.
Mm-hmm. There are some states that are doing a much better job at that than others. And what comes to mind for me is, I believe it's Connecticut, to where they have all the courses, the course numbers are approved at the state level so that transferability from one institution to another is much, much easier. Where I think it goes a little crazy is, of course, California not being crazy as all, is you've got in California, you've got many of the community colleges who are starting and delivering 4-year degrees, something that has been in the purview of the CSU, the Cal State University system, or the UC system. So it's that competing interest that you talk about, and without an overall governing board to, for lack of a better word, be a traffic cop, crazy things can happen.
Yeah, and crazy things can happen, but also at the same time, or maybe another way to describe it is that opportunities are foreclosed. Opportunities for collaboration are foreclosed. And actually, to their credit, the three systems in California, you raised that, they do work together to make sure that students in the community colleges have smooth transfer into the Cal State and UC systems. In fact, and here's where competition can come in to play in a positive way. Community colleges in California compete with each other, not only on access and the quality of their programs and their sports teams and their location near a beach, but also on their transfer rates
Yes.
to Cal Poly or to Berkeley. So that's a very positive way in which systems can not only operate effectively internally, but with other systems, in partnership with other systems. But you're right, Connecticut, lots of states now are really focused on transfer and making sure that students are not wasting time taking additional courses when they move from one institution to another. But there's still many, many barriers, unfortunately, even within systems. Often institutions have a different calendar. They have a different registration process. They have different grading policies. They have different financial aid forms and processes, different email platforms. They can make it very difficult. I don't think they're doing it intentionally, but they have their own processes that seem to serve their own interests really well, but they don't serve the interests of students who are trying to get what they need from the campus they can get it from in a way that's cost effective and convenient for them.
Yeah.
And in this world, when we can do almost anything on these phones that we have, where applications have been incredibly streamlined and efficient, we're pretty spoiled now. And we expect big organizations to treat us well and to have lean, streamlined processes for us to interact with. And I think a lot of universities have a lot to learn about how to improve in that area.
Yeah, I see that quite a bit with the merger work that we do and trying to bring together disparate systems. And it goes even beyond a disparate system. It could be that you've got the same SIS, Student Information System, but by the way you configured it, the type of information you bring together, how do you put it together? It's multi-million dollars to do that. Are you better off running separate platforms? I mean, these are some of the questions that a system could potentially answer, but they
Yes.
don't always.
They don't always. I mean, just a slightly autobiographical thing. One of the things that frustrated me the most as a system head was when I got into a room with institutional research people and they couldn't agree on how a particular variable was defined, the width of the field in this system, how far to take the number, etc. When we have huge challenges and barriers were being thrown up at the level of just the data, just collecting the data. Forget disagreements about what this university's mission and purpose and budget ought to be, and that university's mission and purpose and budget ought to be. No, it was about how big the field was and how frequently that we're going to report and whether we share our numbers with the other campuses. It was very frustrating, I must admit.
Oh, I can certainly understand that. I've seen that so many times. It reminds me of that old axiom. You're here to drain the swamp when you're up to your you know what and alligators. What was the purpose? Why were we here?
Yeah.
So, one of the things that fascinates me about this is the change process. But higher ed is not big on transformational change. And when you try and change something, what reminds me of this is when you try and change something, and you say, okay, we want to change our retention. We want to improve retention. But
Mhm.
you've got one area that you task in it. They come up to the boundaries of where their organization go, and they can't get other parts of the organization on board. As a system, how do you do that? How do you get that kind of change to come through when it's so critical?
Well, it's a great question and it's a difficult one. And there are different strategies for doing it. I think one, it really helps to have that higher purpose clarified so that
Hmm.
in the conversation with people who disagree with each other about whether to, and if so, how to implement this change, then you can evaluate. You can say, okay, person A or campus A, your plan for increasing enrollment is that, and campus B, yours is something else. Okay, which one of those plans advances our goal? The goal that we were given by either the governor or the board. So appealing to a higher purpose, I think, again, can pull people together. But there also, at the same time, has to be persistence because often higher education is bureaucratic and there is a certain power of the bureaucracy of resistance and of protection of its processes, of its controls. And it's not evil at all. I mean, some people do think that bureaucracies are evil. They're incredibly powerful and important organizations for our country, but they often are not as dynamic as they need to be. The great leadership scholar, Ron Heifetz, who wrote the foreword in the book, talks about people not being afraid of change so much as being afraid of loss. And loss can not simply be a job or something like that, but it can be a loss of control or perceived control. Universities are commonly, from an organizational change standpoint, thought of as being incredibly conservative and very resistant to change. Now, one has to understand that then if one wants to transform. That's going to be very difficult. One can do one's best to set up a culture in which there is frequent experimentation, organizational experimentation. One of the reasons I suggest that, Drumm, is because the scientific method and experimentation is something we do. It's built into the DNA, if you will, of higher education. So, to the extent that leaders can tap into the values and practices and processes that are intrinsic in the culture already, people understand experimentation. They understand proving an hypothesis or not, and publishing that and providing people the data and moving on to the next experiment. I think that's a strategy that can be helpful. There's a great chapter in the book by Alison Valancourt on leading change, and it's a nice summary of various change models that organizations can use. But I think it's important to maybe consider an evolutionary model a little more seriously than a transformational model, unless you're in a crisis. And if you're in a crisis, then you better make some things happen. But if you've got the time and you've got the runway and you've got the resources and you're simply trying to optimize effectiveness in response to challenges that you see in the environment or opportunities that are available, then it's probably a more gradual evolutionary model would in the long run be more successful.
And this is typically what happens within higher ed. It's more of an adaptive,
Yeah.
slow, evolutionary change.
Because not everything they do is bad. I mean, there's so much good DNA in higher ed. At the same time, it needs to strike, in my own view, a better balance between maximizing its own interests and allocating those maximal interests into service. And too often, we're not thinking about the service component.
Very well said. Well, Jim, this has been a fascinating conversation for me. Thank you so much for your willingness to come on, as we always do. Three takeaways for university presidents and boards.
One, what's your higher purpose? Two, state goals, state plans, and system goals and plans supporting those, and institutional plans supporting those in turn. And third, really trying to develop adaptive leadership capabilities all the way across the university, not just those in charge, but all the way through, developing those abilities to make the kinds of decisions that need to be made to better serve students and better serve the states these systems are created to serve.
Excellent. Thank you so much. What's next for you besides the next book?
Well, talking about this book, but the next book, which is really going to focus on practical tools for diagnosing, treating, and evaluating organizational dilemmas in higher education. So that's what's next.
So on the cover of the book, there's going to be a baseball bat. Is that correct?
Well, to go with your metaphor there, I would note that if you get it right in baseball, a third of the time, you're going to the Hall of Fame.
This is true, provided you're there for a few seasons.
Yeah.
So, Jim, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome, Drumm. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Jim Johnsen, Vice President of Executive Search for Greenwood Asher and Associates and former President of the University of Alaska System. Jim, thanks so much for being on the program. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk. My next guest is Larry Schall. For those of you who don't know Larry, he's the president of NECHI, the New England Commission for Higher Education. NECHI has a reputation of being one of the most innovative accreditors out there, and Larry will talk to us about what they're doing up at NECHI, how they get the commissioners on board, and a host of other things that are really important for those of you who are thinking about or are accredited. Thanks for listening. Look forward to talking to you next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.